Hey there, and welcome to the Board Game Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm Nick Angiers. With me today, we have a special guest, the one, the only, Professor Scott Rogers. Prof, welcome to the show.
Hello, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Do you mind if I call you Prof?
You can call me Scott. It's fine.
Okay. I just finished reading The Reckoners. I don't know if you're familiar with that series. It's a series of books, and one of the main characters is Prof.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it in the sense that I am working on a superhero game design, and The Reckoners has superheroes, I guess, as the super villain. And so I have looked at the game just to make sure that, when you're making games, you want to make sure that you are not copying anything so much that people can go, hey, you're just a copy of this other game. So I'm aware of it. I've not read the books yet. I hear they're good.
Yeah, they're quite good.
All right. Well, I like superheroes. I'm a long-time superhero comic book reader.
Tom Basson really likes them. Apparently, he's a book critic now, too.
Oh, is he? Okay.
So Professor Rogers, Scott, is very highly involved in the board game industry. He does everything from board game design. He teaches board game design, and he's a podcaster and everything. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But first, Scott, why don't you give us your origin story? How did this all start?
Well, it wouldn't be a conversation about superheroes without an origin story, would it?
Exactly.
So I'll keep it short because it is long and involved and has lots of interesting twists and turns, but I'll keep it tight. So my background originally is in video games. I created what are called AAA games for almost 25 years. These are lots of games that made lots of other people lots of money, and they are probably games that you have played, if not at least heard of. And then in 2011, I given a talk about game design and Disneyland, and I was hired by Walt Disney Imagineering to work in their research and development department, where then I spent 5 years gamifying the Disneyland parks, creating game experiences for real people in a real place. So that was very different than what I was doing with virtual people in a virtual space. And then my division closed down, and I went into education. And I had already at that time written a few books on game design. One called Level Up: The Guide to Great Video Game Design. The other called Swipe This: The Guide to Touchscreen Game Design. This was written right at the kind of the dawn of the iPhone era. And then, so I went into teaching. I've taught at the University of Southern California as a very prestigious game design department. And I also teach at the New York Film Academy, which is where I teach both video game and tabletop game design, and a wide variety of courses, everything from the history of games to level design and narrative theory and all types of fun things. And then when I'm not doing those things, I have what I call my jobbie, which is my hobby that is a job, and that is designing board games, two of which I've had published. The first one was called Rayguns and Rocketships in, I want to say 2017, I believe it came out. And then the second was Pantone the Game, which came out in 2018. I have two that are due out next year, and I have another half dozen being reviewed by different publishers, so fingers crossed.
Wow. Okay. So first of all, congratulations on that repertoire of accomplishments. You're very much a Renaissance man of the game design world. So one thing I wonder about is doing all these things, how do you get so much stuff done? Do you sleep, or like what does a day look like for you? Or will 1 year be focused on one thing and then another thing?
Oh no, that would require a plan of some sort. No, the irony is, Nick, I feel like I'm not doing anywhere as near work as I should, particularly this year. We're recording this in 2020. And as I'm sure everybody who is listening to this has had kind of a rough year. And so this has been a little tough for myself creatively. I feel like I'm moving much slower on my creative endeavors than I should. One of my games that is due to be published next year was bumped from this year just because the publisher thought it'd be wiser, and I agree. I think it was a good call. So what does my day look like? Well, when I'm not teaching, which I do exclusively through Zoom right now, and I teach about, I want to say about 15 hours or so, maybe 20 hours of class a week. And then the rest of the time I use either prepping for classes, because as you know, teacher's work is never done, even if you have the curriculum all nailed down. And then the rest of the time I'm either, I do have a podcast. Actually, I have two podcasts that I do. One is board game related, and that is called Ludology. And this is an award-winning podcast started by Jeff Engelstein and then kind of handed over to Gil Hova and Emma Larkins and myself. I call myself a co-co-host because I show up like every third or fourth episode. And then I do a segment for that called Biography of a Board Game, which I think airs about once a month. But the Biography of a Board Game segments are history-based, and so they require a lot of research to do. So part of my month is spent researching, and I'll even longer, depends on the game. It might take a few months to actually prepare a biography of a board game segment, and they're not very long. They're maybe 10, 12 minutes at the most, but I try to pack a lot of information into them. And these are, just for those of you that are your audience that doesn't know, it's essentially a history of a game title, where it, who created it, where it, idea-wise, where it came from, how it matured, what form did it take when it was published, how did it grow as a game, like expand into expansions or other versions, and then ultimately I talk about what influence the game has had on other titles. So, I've done about 52 of these things now, and I've talked about everything from Jenga to I think I did Ouija board last week, which is barely a game but has a very interesting history. So that takes up a fair amount of my time during the month. But then, of course, I am constantly designing games. My wife says I'm like a beaver and I'm constantly gnawing. I have a series of notebooks that I keep my game designs in. And so I'm constantly jotting down ideas in those. And then I've recently been translating several of my game concepts and published works into Tabletop Simulator. I haven't published them, I guess. Is that what you would call it, publishing them? Right. So they're about ready to go. And I was a little slow to the party for Tabletop Simulator, but I feel like I'm pretty good at it now. And I just need to get playtesters to join me to try some of these guys out, because two of them in particular are ones that I'm very excited about and have been shopping around a little bit. But in this virtual era that we find ourselves in, people want to play it for themselves, since we don't have the conventions that we normally can do this at. But secondly, just it's good to have. I think it's kind of becoming a new requirement for game designers to have a digital version, so that way you can go to anybody. I can now go to anyone around the world and say, hey, I've got an awesome game design. I would love for you to take a look at it. Here's the game. Here are the rules. Let's play, or play with your friends or whatever.
So you mentioned the Ludology podcast. For those of you listening, if you've never listened to Ludology before, you should definitely check it out. If you like board games, it tells you about how board games work, and it's really awesome. you should listen to it for sure. It's Ludology, and that's a real word. It just means like the study of gameplay.
Study of play. Ludo is Greek for play.
So it looks like your bread and butter is the teaching side.
Right. That's how I make my income.
Yeah, and the others, like all the design and the podcasting, are all kind of side hustles, at least for now.
Yep. Yeah.
And is that the way you like it? Do you want to keep it that way?
I am traditionally what they would call in Japan a salary man.
Okay.
25 years or so of my career have been working for some of the biggest game creators in the business, Sony and Capcom and Disney and Namco, and a company that unfortunately is no longer around called THQ. And so I was a salaried employee. Once in a blue moon, I'd get a bonus for something that I do. But I used to say that I have made a lot of people I calculated it once, and it's been billions of dollars. And what I really have to show for it is one of the companies gave me a very nice jacket. So around 2013 or so is when I started working on Rayguns and Rocketships, which was originally started as a video game pitch. And I'm like, I'd kind of like to make a few dollars for myself. Now, that's not the main reason why I made the game. But I had a realization earlier. That book Level Up that I had written in 2009, and it's had a second printing since then. That is for any creative person. That is my recommendation to how, right now, at least as of 2020, the best way to kind of make a financial living. And that is to make as many things as you can that you then can earn royalties on. Now, granted, earning royalties requires some negotiation, and you need the right partners, people that you can trust, people that will honor that. But that said, I'm making some nice royalties off of a couple of my books and a couple of my games. And so once a year, I receive a series of checks that kind of balances out to maybe a month or two's worth of my regular employment. So it's a nice little bump that allows me to then reinvest that into either a game design or whatever project that I happen to be working on, or just put it in an investment fund and try to make some money that way. So the more content you make, the more content you can monetize. And you can make a little bit of money off of podcasting as well. Or if you have a Patreon, like I do, if you do Scott Rogers Designer, I have a Patreon. And for a few dollars, you can help sponsor me making these prototypes that will hopefully become games.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a strategy I've never heard before is, I have heard of entrepreneurs making mini assets or micro assets where you make them once, so you don't get paid for making it. But once you've created it, then it gives you recurring income, passive income, that kind of thing. So you would recommend books being a good way to do that?
It depends. Books are just as difficult, maybe more so than board games, because it helps to have a partner who is interested in keeping it what's called evergreen. So you've heard of evergreen board games. Well, there are also evergreen books. Now, my books are nonfiction, and they happen to be written in a way that are very appealing to the target audience. It has lots of pictures, it has humor. It's still an academic book, but it's very different than the other academic books out there. And so I get usually a piece of mail a month from somebody saying how much they enjoyed my book. And usually they say, well, the reason why I like it is it's very approachable and very practical, and it's funny. And there's a lot of I'm a cartoonist at heart. And so there's cartoons in it, and there's even a really good chili recipe. So if you like chili, I highly recommend you check out Level Up. And as a result, the book has kept selling. We just passed our 300th review on Amazon. and which is not nothing. It doesn't seem like a lot when you look at J.K. Rowling or Stephen King or someone like that. But for a nonfiction book about video game design, 300 is, I believe I have the most reviews on Amazon so far. I'm not sure. Maybe there's one other person, but at least in the terms of video game design books. For me, that's exciting. I've kind of seen that happen over, it's taken years to do this. It's not something that happened immediately. But what that means is when people go onto Amazon and they look, they see that my game or my book has the most reviews, and they're almost mostly positive. And so that encourages them to try it. And so this is, it's the same with board games. You go onto Board Game Geek, and I'm sure if you are interested in a game that isn't, that's already been published, of course. Kickstarter is a whole different beast. But I'm sure that, Nick, if I told you about a game, if I said, hey, I know of a fantastic game called Red November, just picking a title off of the top of my head. And you were to be like, oh, Red November, I've never heard of that game before. Let me go on to Board Game Geek and check it out. And if you see that it has a good review or good, rating, you might consider picking it up if you can find a copy. I don't know if it's out of print or not, but
I think so, yeah.
But it's a good game. I don't know what its BGG rating is. I can check, but for the most part, that's at least that's what I do. I'm sure a lot of other people do as well. As BGG is pretty much the only real. I mean, I'm sure there are other review sites out there, but none of them have the depth or breadth. Red November is a 6.3, but that does not make it a bad game.
6.3 is pretty commendable.
It's not bad.
I haven't seen many games over 7 point something.
Yeah, it's hard to maintain a rating in the 8s and even sometimes the 7s. My own 2 games are in the 6s. I wish they were a little higher, but whatever. But if you look at the way that BGG kind of classifies their rating breakdown, a 6 is still like, sure, I'll play it anytime. So it's I think that the numbers don't quite reflect the attitude of the game and how it's reviewed sometimes. But
I don't really understand the algorithm for BGG.
Well, I think a lot of it is it's a popularity contest, right? And like most popularity contests, it's very biased. And that's the reason why I don't like games like Apple to Apples and Cards Against Humanity, because I don't like games with judges. And unfortunately, ratings are games with judges.
Right. When I go on to BGG to look up the ratings per se for a game, I usually won't look at I'll take the number with a grain of salt. What I'll look at is at the reviews that people left.
Right.
And if it's like someone gives it a bad review, but it's not relevant to me, then I'll just forget about that. And I'll look for ones that are actually relevant to me, and then I'll base some of my decision on that. And I have not bought games just because someone said something that would make me feel that it's not a good game. But I have bought games that had not so good reviews, but it still looked fun, and it's a silly little game. Like, do you know You Gotta Be Kidding Me? It's Liar's Dice, but it's on cards with pictures of cute kittens.
Sure.
Yeah, there were some not so lovely reviews on there, but it was exactly what I was looking for. And I've gotten so much use out of that game just because you can just pick it up and you can play 10 people and explain the rules in 30 seconds. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's I think, a thing that a lot of people tend to forget is they put a lot of weight on other people's opinions. They put a lot of weight on other people's numbers. And ultimately, I believe it's up to the individual to make their own decision and try not to be as swayed by public opinion as, I myself as a game player, I always say I will play anything once. I don't, that too. And I don't, and then to be honest, I will go out of my way to play games that people say are bad games. I'm using finger quotes here, because I feel as a game creator, I can learn anything from a game, especially a bad one.
Exactly.
And so as an educator, this is something I'm trying to reinforce in my students all the time, because I find them often very reluctant to play things that are considered bad, unless it's so bad that it's good. You know, there are certain, particularly in the video game world, there are some games that are just awful, but they're kind of lovely in their awfulness.
Goat Simulator was an amazing game for 20 minutes.
Right.
I
Well,
laughed so hard for that 20 minutes.
Goat Simulator is of a genre that is intentionally bad, because that's I'm blanking on what the name I used to give it, but essentially it's a game with bad controls. There's Surgeon Simulator 2 or 3000 and Octodad, and there's lots of video games. This is a whole subgenre in video games. These games with like lousy controls, but that's the fun. They're humor games, and the humor comes from you wrestling with the controls. Now, if you go into the game without realizing that, you're going to be frustrated by the controls and think there's a terrible game, when in reality the fun is in the ridiculousness of the controls.
Right. So I have a feeling that a lot of people would have given that game bad reviews. So you have to form your own opinions.
Exactly. Yeah. Think for yourself, right? Go figure.
Question authority. So your professorship is for video game design or tabletop design, or is it the same thing?
It's so my professor title is at USC, and it is for their what they call their interactive media department.
Okay.
Now, when I taught there, mostly I teach either level design or narrative design. But when I'm teaching at NIFA, I've taught a really wide spectrum of games, of classes pertaining to games. Everything from, like I said, the history of video games. I teach a class it's known as systems literacy. It's really a board game design or paper prototyping design class, but it examines games as systems, and there's a lot of it's all based around a text that our chair wrote or co-wrote back in the day, called Game Design Workshop, and it's he and Tracy Fullerton, who used to run USC, their interactive media department. It's essentially a kind of a play first, they call it play centric design, and it really emphasizes building a prototype, iterating it on it as quickly as possible, failing fast, as the kids say now, and then just keep banging on it until it is in the shape that you want it to be, but it's also polished to an extent, at which then at some point, either in the case of video games, the publisher is going to take it away from you, or you feel that it's ready to present to other human beings with opinions, who then can bash on it, and you then go through kind of the whole cycle again, and then eventually at some point, there's a variety of different reasons why the game is considered done, and then it's released into the world, where then it gets judged by the court of public approval.
All right. And how does one become a board game or an interactive media teacher or designer?
Educator?
What's the path here?
So I was working, actually, I think I had already finished Level Up. So I wrote Level Up while I was working for a video game publisher. And part of my job was to travel around the world and meet with developers who were working on video games. My title is creative manager, and my job was to help them make their games better. I was like a design expert who knew enough about game design and knew where problems would happen, in order to come in and say, look, here are the 5 top things you're kind of doing wrong or could be better. Let me give you some advice on how you can make that better. Let's work together to resolve these issues, because you will have a better game after you've resolved these things. And so I'm coming in with an objectivity that they don't have. And game designers, no matter what, or any creative really, but game designers in particular get what I call designer blinders, which is, I'm putting my hands up next to my eyes here, like horse blinders. Mm-hmm. And you're getting hyper focused on just getting the thing made. All that matters is I just want it done. And sometimes you will neglect some very important truths about your game because you are not looking at it from a wide perspective. And so I always would say that I was coming in with what I call the 10,000 foot view. I was looking at the game holistically, the whole, I could see the curvature of the earth, as it were, of the game. And I could say, well, yeah, this little sliver, you're doing great, but you've got all these other things that are going to cause problems if you don't fix this. So, so as I was going to all these teams all over the world, I would find myself saying the same things over and over again. And I would joke with my team and I'd be like, I'm just going to write a book. I'm going to give it to you. You can read the book. And then once you're done with my book, then if you have any questions, we can talk. Right. It was essentially born out of this frustration to kind of stop repeating myself, but also to keep track of the advice. I realized, not to toot my own horn, but I was giving some good advice and I wanted to catalog it somewhere so I wouldn't forget it. And sometimes I would say, wow, that's a really, I described that in a really good way. I need to remember that. Otherwise it's going to be lost. So when I was at a game conference called the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. This is GDC, something that's held every year. They've just recently, within the past 3 years, expanded it to board game design, although they have not invited me to talk yet there. But back in the day, I was actually a pretty, like they would give kind of awards for speakers, and I ended up winning a couple of years in a row because I had good talks. But one of the talks that I gave was about game level design in Disneyland. And you can find this online if you have any interest in Disneyland. It's called Everything I Learned About Level Design I Learned from Disneyland. And I talk about a lot of really great things that Disney does well. But somebody in the audience found out about or passed it on to somebody who was a publisher at a company called Wiley & Sons. And they said, hey, this guy's really smart. You should talk to him about writing a book. And they reached out to me and they said, hey, can you write a book about this topic? And I said, well, not just Disneyland and level design, but probably have to be more than that. And they said, well, what would you write about? And I said, well, ironically, I have been making an outline of the book that I would write because I've been talking to all these other people. And so kind of that outline combined with my talk became the basis of Level Up. So I finish Level Up and it gets out there and people start to read it and they go, oh, this is actually pretty good. And I had a friend who was teaching at USC that I met through some event, probably a conference or something. And he said, hey, he was essentially the second in charge of the program. And he said, hey, I'm trying to put together a level design class and I would love for you to kind of teach the class. And I said, well, I don't really, I've never taught anybody other than writing this book. And B, I'm not a super technical savvy person. I'm a game designer, but I'm not a programmer. And I don't try to make anybody believe that I am. They're very different disciplines, particularly when you're working in console game design. And he said, that's okay. I'll handle the technical part if you handle the creative part. I said, great. So I started teaching there. I taught for several semesters. A lot of my students have gone on to become very big names in the industry, actually, which is very cool. And then eventually NIFA, when I was done at Disney, a fellow who I'd worked with at a previous job said, hey, we're looking for teachers. Would you be interested? And I was kind of in between jobs, and the economy as it is now is a gig economy, right? It's all about having multiple jobs, and nobody has just one job anymore. And my boss at NIFA was like, yeah, you can still write your books. You can still make board games and other things if you teach. And I'm like, sure, that sounds great. So that's how I became a full-time professor was thanks to that generous offer from NIFA.
Okay. So I think the big takeaway here is, instead of the traditional route where you learn a discipline and then you go and apply for a job and then you get the job and that's what you do, what we could summarize, what we could conclude from your story is that be prepared, have really good skills, and get some experience, talking, hone down your words, and then eventually opportunities will present themselves in the case of both your book and your education career.
Right. I am not a believer in what most people call luck. As a matter of fact, I actively teach against it. My class coming up next week, I rail against the term luck, because luck is just statistics and percentages that either go the way we want them to or not want them to. And it's an emotional response, right? Oh, I had bad luck. The dice are unlucky tonight because I'm not getting my rolls that I want or whatever. But I do believe in, and I unfortunately don't know who to attribute this saying to, but the saying is that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And I'm a huge believer in that because my entire career has been based on that. Now, the other thing that you have to realize are two things. One, you have to be open to those opportunities. So you have to make yourself available to them. They won't just land in your lap if you stay at home. The other is that probably about 85% of all my opportunities have come through friends. And so your network of friends and contacts is extremely important. And if you don't have enough friends, a good way to make friends is to do things that people then recognize. So for example, Nick, you reached out to me because you said, hey, I really like Biography of a Board Game. And I said, thank you. That's a very kind thing for you to say. And so now here we are talking, and I'm doing something that helps you, which is for your podcast, and you're doing something that is helping me, which is spreading the information that Scott Rogers is a good game designer, or hopefully perceived as a good game designer. So there we go. We have now helped each other out, and that is what everybody should strive to do, is to make friends. I'm not saying just make friends for the fact of opportunistic nature. I hope, Nick, that we stay in touch beyond this and talk more about games, even if it's not being recorded. But make friends and seek opportunities, but also do the work. And if you have those three things, I guarantee good things will come your way.
Rig your own dice.
Yeah, exactly. Make your own luck. Do it. Just do it. That is my number one bit of advice I give to anybody where they say, how do I start making games? And I say, writers write books, musicians play music, game designers make games. We play games, but playing games does not make you a game designer. It just makes you a gamer. And there's nothing wrong with being a gamer. That's great. I'm a gamer, but I'm also a game designer because I am constantly making games. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to make, it doesn't matter what type of game. It can be a video game. It can be a ARG. It can be a role-playing game. It can be a board game. It can be a game that you play with your niece or nephew just for fun to kill an hour or two. But if you are passionate about game design, you will constantly be making games.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great. And I would also like to hear, I've heard the story before on Ludology about being a Disney Imagineer, but for those of our listeners who haven't heard about it, could you tell us just a little bit of the background, what it's like to do this job that to a lot of people is like the most amazing job in the world?
It is the most amazing job in the world. I had a wonderful time being an Imagineer, but it was also one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. So, my first week of work, my boss pulled me aside, who had been an Imagineer for, he was at that point, I think he had been working the job for about 20 some odd years. And he said, this, first of all, for those of you that don't know what this is, a Disney Imagineer is the term that Walt Disney came up with for the people that worked on the theme parks. And in the early days, He pulled people, a lot of them from animation, and then eventually he realized, he needed engineers, and he needed architects, and he needed roboticists, and he needed et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of different classifications of people that you would call an Imagineer. What's really funny is when I tell people that I used to be an Imagineer, they would say, "Oh, I know somebody who was an Imagineer. Do you know so-and-so?" And I would laugh, because odds are I probably did not know them, because there is a lot of Imagineers. We're an elite group, but there's still thousands of us. But that said, what I would do was, like I said, I was trying to gamify the Disneyland parks. Now, other people had been doing this. My personal hero in this department is a friend of mine whose name is Jonathan Ackley. And if you've been to Disney World, he did games like Sorcerers of the Magic Kingdom, and the Kim Possible and Agent P World Adventures, and something called I believe it's called Pirate Adventure. These are all kind of a mix of a role-playing game or an ARG with these interactive installations where you literally are getting messages either through a phone or some other communication device, or sometimes through the world itself or written on paper. And you're traveling around this physical property and getting clues and fulfilling quests and things like that. So they wanted to do the same like that in Disneyland. And after I gave that Disneyland talk, they said, "Oh, Scott sounds like the perfect person to do that." And the good news was I was the perfect person to do that. I loved the job. I loved every minute of it, although, like I said, there were moments that were not great. And, like any high stakes job, it's a lot of hours and a lot of effort and a lot of energy that goes into it. But I always say that I've been to the top of the Matterhorn and the basement of the Haunted Mansion. I have some pretty rad photographs of me goofing around with Pirates of the Caribbean characters and sitting very thoughtfully in Winnie the Pooh ride, things like that, things that most people don't ever get an opportunity to do because they're on a moving vehicle, where I am, working within that thing. But it was pretty amazing. And we created what eventually became, they like I said, they had stopped production on the project I worked on, and that's when I left. But they picked it back up again because they realized it was too good of an idea to leave, to not live. And if you're a Disneyland fan or Disney World fan at all, and you use an app called Disney Play, essentially that is the result of the work that me and my team initially did for the park. And yeah, it's nice to know that it exists in some capacity. It's something that you can play when Disney World is back open, but hopefully Disneyland will be soon enough once we kind of get things under control here in California. And but it also, as a creator, as a game creator, it really got me to think about games in a very different way and in a very physical way. Because like I said, my background was in video games. So everything was virtual or using a controller. So now my players are real people in real places that may or may not be interacting with real things, or sometimes even virtual things. So it got me to think a lot. And I even designed board games that people could play. They never got produced, unfortunately. But I did a lot of trying to integrate ideas from board gaming into these types of play scenarios. And if some of them had been made, oh man, I wish I could share some of the ideas because I'm under a pretty strict NDA. But I'll tell you, there were some pretty amazing things that we talked about doing that. No, about 99% of the things that we talked about never got made, of course. And so if the 1% that you do see, which are some pretty amazing things, you can only imagine how crazy some of the other 99% was.
Right. It's just like tabletop game design. The games that you see are like the best of the best, refined down to its best possible state. You don't see all the ideas that the designers threw out, or that they spent hours and hours and hours on, they just couldn't get to work. Yeah.
Now that brings me to my biography, back to my biography of a board game podcast, because I feel that the industry could benefit from people knowing more about how games are made. There's a few resources out there that do this. I would say in print media, Tabletop Gaming Magazine occasionally runs some nice articles about game design. Like, they're a few pages long, but they give a little bit of insight. There are some game designers that are very good about chronicling their work. I want to say guys like Anton Bauza, I think, is one of them that comes to mind. He's pretty in depth about his game design process, but it's not very common. And so my podcast, Biography of a Board Game, or the segment that's in Ludology, is trying to shine some light on the people. Don't get me wrong, the people are extremely important, but I took a slightly different tact and looked at the game, because I find that games often take on a life of their own, particularly once they have been established for a while, and particularly in how they influence other game creators. And so myself, and I'm sure anybody who is serious about designing games wants to know, well, what's been done in the past, and let's not have to reinvent the wheel. That's the beauty of games as an industry, is that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and every game that comes out, no matter how big or small, can influence somebody else into making another game.
Right.
So I think it's important to know that where they come from, and I'm trying to do my part to educate people in a fun way about what goes into making a game.
Excellent. Well, let's wrap this thing up. My last question is a fun one. What awesome thing would you like to give a shout out to? It can be any book, or game.
Actually, it's a movie. Yeah, I want to give a shout out to a movie. So this summer, I was very privileged to be a part of a documentary film called Game Master. And this came out in July, and it is a feature-length documentary film that you can get on Amazon Prime, or I think Vudu, or iTunes, or if you own a PlayStation or a Xbox Live, you can buy it through that. And it is a documentary film about 5 game designers, myself included, talking about what it took to bring their game to life. And the stories are very diverse, and they're fascinating, and they're everyone from a woman who is from the Middle East, who was trying to get out of an arranged marriage, and so she designed a board game to kind of protest that situation, to a fellow who went into business with his parents to kind of help realize, kind of gamify their passion, which was traveling around the national parks of the world, to a fella from East LA who grew up amongst gang violence and a really kind of rough upbringing, but he managed to turn his life experience into a board game, to Alon Lee, who is the guy who created Exploding Kittens, which is arguably one of the most successful games out there. So it's a really great film. It's really well made. Like I said, I'm very proud to be attached to it. I talk about my game Rayguns and Rocketships in it, and I highly recommend anybody who even has a passing interest in board games and how they're made and what the culture and what it's like to be a board game designer and kind of the ups and downs. I highly recommend you watch it.
I've heard so many good things about it. I tried to watch it on Amazon, but it's not available in Canada on Amazon Prime.
Oh yeah, I've heard that. It's I think soon though. I keep hearing rumblings of it getting up to you guys. Yeah, there's so many board gamers up in Canada. I want them all to see it. I think that they would all really enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Scott. This has been incredible talking to you. Thank you so much for your time and your energy.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find online. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Mighty Bedbug. I am Scott Rogers, game designer on Facebook. where I have kind of a professional presence, I guess. You can have like a pro page, I guess. Or if you, I know times are very tough for everybody, but if you have a few dollars that you're interested in throwing in the way of a game designer, if you go Scott Rogers Designer on Patreon, I offer a look at behind the scenes, like those notebooks that I'm talking about, you can see the work that I do in them. I have video content, and every month I create a print and play game for the Patreons. So you get a game a month essentially.
In your massive amounts of spare time.
Yeah, exactly. Keeps me out of trouble.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks very much, and thanks all for listening. Happy gaming, everyone.
Take care. Be safe, everyone.